The Middle East is in turmoil, and anti-Muslim sentiment in the West has rarely been higher. Many are preparing for an apocalyptic battle in which Muslims are the enemy. Nevertheless, a chosen few have crossed oceans and borders to undertake missionary work in Muslim communities. Our guest today, Devon Phillips, spent years with Frontier Alliance International in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. And she's here today to help us sort out what's happening in the Middle East and how we can reach Muslims with the gospel of the kingdom.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You are listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. All right, Devon Phillips, welcome to Messiah Podcast. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me on, Jacob. Long listener of Messiah Podcast, and so it's an honor to be on here with you.
Oh, wow. Well, it's an honor to have you on here. You know, you're one of those people we've had several on this season where you've been very, very busy for the kingdom for a long time, but not in such a way that you've earned like a Wikipedia page about it, and but which probably may be good for some of the kinds of work that you've been doing. But for our listeners who may just have no idea, can you give us your CV and sort of tell us where you've been, where you came from, what you've been up to?
Absolutely. Well, I currently live in Cambridge in the UK. So I work for a research center, a biblical research center called Tyndale House. And I work for the scholars there, helps particularly international scholars who are coming in to study. It's a very large collection of biblical studies, particularly. And so people come from all over the world to use the library there, and they stay on site. And so it's a very exciting place to be if you love scriptures. It's a wonderful privilege to be there. So that's where I'm based currently. But before that, I was in Israel for many years. I lived in the Golan Heights. So if anyone has a bit of a sketchy idea of the geography of Israel, that's we were tucked up right between the borders of Lebanon and Syria in northern Israel. And then before that, I was actually in Syria for a little bit. I was also in Iraq for a little while, and I was in Jordan for a little while as well. And so all of those places in the Middle East, I was with an organization called Frontier Alliance International, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. I think you've had some guests that have also been affiliated with Frontier Alliance International, but it is an organization focused on reaching unreached people groups in the Middle East. And they do that in many different ways. And so for the most part, I was with kind of disciple making groups and medical relief groups, but did a little bit of everything while I was with them, and in a lot of different places as you can hear. So those are kind of probably the main highlights of the CV. Wow.
I want to ask about all of that, but before I ask about all that, I've been reading Middlemarch. George Eliot has this beautiful prelude where she talks about Saint Teresa of Avila, and remarks that perhaps thousands of women have desired to do just extraordinary things for the kingdom, but the men in their lives told them that wasn't for them. It broke too far with societal conventions and expectations. So I wanted to ask. I was reading that recently, and then I heard about you and read about you a little bit. And I thought, well, here's someone who clearly has heard the call. What was that like? Like, what inspired you to go to the Middle East? And did you encounter resistance when you told your friends and family, like, I'm going to go to Iraq now? It's like, are you okay?
Well, I think it's just so typical of the Lord to use the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. I think just as an example that came to mind when you were talking about perhaps it not being maybe people's first or most ideal thought to send maybe single women into war zones in the Middle East. When we were in Syria, and this was an active war zone that we were in when we were in Syria, it was mostly women actually on the team. And I was helping to recruit, and we were desperately looking for men to join the team. And for multiple reasons, but just not finding anyone who was suitable, who had the kind of the correct heart attitude, maybe to go into Syria, because it's also very high risk. You can't make a lot of mistakes in this particular environment. And so going into Syria, I realized this is the Lord's strategy to have women here. Women were not threatening. Most people didn't assume that we were spies. A lot of the group didn't have very much of an idea of what was going on politically in Syria, and that actually helped us a lot because, again, no one thought we were spies, and we had access to families. You could go into houses without being threatening as a woman, and as a man, it would have required a lot more protocol to actually go into somebody's home. You could meet in all of these kind of outside places. You could go for coffee. You could do all sorts of things and have freedom in that way. But when it came to access to people's houses, that was another issue entirely. And so we think that wisdom is one thing, and often the Lord's wisdom is so much higher than ours, and we can realize once we get there that He might have had a purpose in something that we thought was a mistake. And so it was not easy on my family, that's for sure, to be in war zones. It was not comprehensible to many people. I even have this memory of standing on the border between Israel and Syria, because we entered just through a gate in the fence, and it would take a huge team from the Israel Defense Forces. Every time they opened that gate, they would have a line of snipers. They would have a whole security team there. And I just remember the snipers watching as we just waited for the gate to open. You could tell on their faces that they thought we were crazy. But I hope that kind of was a witness. And we did get a lot of questions, and we're able to say, we're doing this because of Yeshua. We're doing this because we want to serve you, and we want to serve the people of Syria in His name. So it opened up a lot of doors as well, but it definitely seemed the height of foolishness to many people, for sure.
Wow. When did you what did that call feel like? Like, did you just wake up one day and you were like, yeah, it's missions to Arabs. That's what I'm doing. Or did someone ask you and you at first you were like, probably not. And then you prayed about it and you're like, okay, maybe. Or what was that like?
Actually, it was pretty similar to that. I think, even going back further, my grandparents on my father's side were missionaries in East Africa. And so I did have a lot of that missions, pioneering spirit, Great Commission, conviction in my blood and in my heritage. And so that was something that I kind of grew up hoping that the Lord would call me into the foreign fields. And then,
okay.
But I was very, very focused on South Asia. I did work a lot with Muslim ministries that were focused on India, Pakistan, places like that. And did a lot of my time in my 20s was spent working with Muslim outreach to South Asian communities specifically, in and around the Chicagoland area. And I was in India for a little bit. But I was really hoping that the Lord was going to call me long term to India. And in His kindness, His very great kindness, He was very clear to me that actually He was calling me to the Middle East. And that's when I initially launched with FAI in Jordan. And I was with a team in Jordan for a couple of years, learning Arabic and doing disciple making work.
Wow. So missions to Muslims is one of those things that I think for most evangelicals, at least, it's something that they would acknowledge sure needs to happen. The whole world is the mission field. But there's a lot of people who I think right now just want to kill everyone over there. Like they're just tired of it, the conflict and the terrorism and things. And it's just, there's just so much antipathy. It can cloud that kingdom desire to say, well, what really needs to happen is they all need to come to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you're one of those who you've gone over and you've done disciple making work amongst Muslims. Can you talk about that for a while? I mean, is this on what scale are missions like this happening, and are they receptive, and how have you found that do you need to reframe the message for that community in order to for them to be receptive? Like what are the challenges? I mean, I want to know all about it. I just asked you about 5 questions.
No problem. Hopefully I will remember and answer them in turn. I think, as you said, I come from an evangelical background. I grew up in a believing family. And of course, Great Commission is very central. When our master commanded that we go, from Jerusalem, Samaria to the ends of the earth, and bear witness to him, to all peoples. And so that would probably be what most missions groups would focus on, I would say, in terms of outreach to Muslims. And of course, you've got kind of this missiological history of the last few centuries where the pushes strategically and practically first were to the coastlands. Let's reach all of the coastlands. And then you had a big inland movement where you have several missions groups still called Africa Inland Mission, China Inland Mission, where it was to go to the interior. And
J. Hudson Taylor.
Exactly. And then the push now in missions is to unreached people groups. And from a just purely practical level, Islam is a very fast growing religion, and it is a huge religion, and it comprises most of the people groups that are still considered unreached by missiologists. And so just from a purely practical standpoint, ministry and mission to Muslims is a very practical focus to have. I think also, as you said, I kind of came of age. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and there was kind of, if there was not an awareness of Islamic fundamentalism before in kind of the American public, there certainly was. Then it was actually very interesting in early college days. Someone handed me Joel Richardson's book entitled Islamic Antichrist. I'd never heard of Joel Richardson. And my initial reaction when they handed me this book was, oh my goodness, we've switched from the eschatology being Russia, which was the enemy of the last decade, to the Antichrist being the Islamic terrorists, which is the kind of main enemy of the Americans in this age. And I was determined to read the book and debunk it for my friends, and little did I realize that was going to be a bit of a life-changing book for me in terms of, it was mainly a comparison between Islamic eschatology and biblical eschatology, which was very interesting, but it would also, Worth the Price of Admittance is one of the appendices just on the importance of eschatology. And when you come from an evangelical background, usually there's a lot of discomfort around eschatology, or certain strains of evangelicalism. It's just, don't want to touch it. It's too controversial. People who are really into it are very weird. And so just it's not worth thinking about. It's not going to make a big difference one way or the other. And his appendix, where he just makes a case for the importance of having that anchor of future hope, and being very clear in kind of this apocalyptic gospel, that it's not just Jesus forgave your sins, but there's going to be the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And that was probably a spark for me going into Muslim missions as well, because just as we're a very apocalyptic based movement, so is Islam. And so they're also very focused on the day of judgment and what's to come, and they're motivated and driven by that in the same way that I'm motivated and driven by the day of the Lord. And so just realizing that, and that they have an urgency and that I have an urgency around that, but different allegiances, different different outcomes, different fruit from those anchors in the future. And so that was another reason why I was very drawn to Muslim ministry. And lastly, as you said as well, there's a lot of antipathy in the West towards Muslims, towards Islam, a lot of suspicion around terrorism. And I think that it's impossible to minister to a people if you don't love them. And there's a lot of people ministering to Muslims that actually do not love them. And I think you can have a Jonah-like witness. You can kind of go into the city and there's fruit in that, and the Lord can use it. But I think that it's very important to be able to hold friends and people that you build life with and around in a deep love that's in Messiah. And that's where some other people working in Muslim ministries can kind of have the opposite effect, where you so identify and you so love and are consumed by kind of the culture of your neighbors, if you're living in a Muslim majority area, for instance, that you also take on the offense of those people, where you hate Israel and you're very offended by the mystery of election, and you feel like supersessionism is the name of the game. And so there's a pendulum swing for sure, and you want to make sure not to go to either extreme. And it's a very difficult tightrope to walk sometimes.
Yeah, you mentioned the word allegiance, and that's. Does it feel like being a traitor? Does it feel like defection to say, "Oh, I still believe the end of the world is coming, but actually, it's going to be a Jew who's sitting on the judgment seat," and we're not the special people. It's actually the people that we've been hating are the special people that God, they're God's chosen nation. Like, I came from dispensationalism, right? So it wasn't a gigantic leap from, the Jewish people were God's chosen people in the last dispensation, and they will be during the tribulation, and they kind of are now, to saying, well, no, it's always been Israel, it's still Israel. But for someone for whom but I was always very friendly to Israel. I was always like, Israel's always a Zionist, right? But to come from being like, well, Israel's the little Satan and America's the great Satan, to being like, well, I don't know about America, but Israel is, God's. Is that are people making that shift? And what? It seems like it would almost have to be supernatural. Does God just reveal it to them, or what happens?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. What was really interesting to me when I joined FAI and I landed in Jordan, I myself still had very vague ideas about the gospel of the kingdom, kind of what did biblical Israel have to do with national Israel today? Several things that were vague in my mind. As you said, I was friendly, but in terms of being able to articulate the gospel of the kingdom clearly, an Israel-centric gospel to Muslims, that was something that I had a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn, but there's been a lot of growth over the last decade or so for me in those areas, which I'm so grateful. I feel like when those concepts clicked in my mind, the scriptures became Technicolor 3D. Suddenly it became so many things that had been very vague or opaque became clear, became exciting. I could see the overall story of scripture. I could see the continuity of all the covenants. I had a clear idea of who Israel was. And to bring a gospel that doesn't have that robust clarity, that doesn't have that fullness, first of all, that's what the Muslim world deserves. They deserve a full gospel. They deserve a full gospel witness. Just like Gentiles who will often approach election teachings with offense. They have even more barriers theologically, culturally, politically to being able to accept that message. But if they do, and they do, which is always, as you said, miraculous, it both anchors them because there's so much instability in the Muslim world around what is truly going on in the Middle East. It's so complicated. There's so much disinformation that's being served to everyone. That clarity can bring just an anchor in that instability. But also, you save people from being caught up in this antichrist, anti-covenant spirit, protecting them from that in discipleship. And you also have one of the things that was very interesting to me about this most recent conflict in Gaza is there are many people in Israel asking, where are the righteous among the nations? During the Holocaust, we had people who would help us, who would hide us, who would, sacrifice themselves, put their own safety on the line to protect us. And there's no one in Gaza who's doing that. And perhaps there are stories that will come out later, but we have not had any of those stories. We've not had any of that witness. And it breaks my heart because I think of how the body of Christ has really done a huge disservice to the people of Gaza. Because if they've discipled them at all, they've discipled them with a weak, not full gospel. And they have aided and abetted an anti-covenant spirit amongst them. And it has left them open to this culture of evil that is not, that doesn't help any of the hostages or anything like that. And so my heart is that should, God forbid, something similar happen in the future, that the people surrounding the state of Israel, or even the Arab peoples living within the state of Israel, that there would be a witness, that there would be discipleship amongst them that would prepare them to endure that time, as well as to be people that are righteous, that act righteously during that time as well. And so I think that approach to Muslim ministry is not common, but I think that if you can do outreach with the gospel of the kingdom, and you do have people who receive it, and there are people who beautifully receive it, just like the Syrophoenician woman, when the master told her, I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel, and she had no offense for that. There are people who are able to receive that message with no offense, who are able to say, all were consigned to destruction so that you could show mercy on all. I'm fine with crumbs, but that is more than I deserve anyway. And to have that humility of spirit, to be able to approach these concepts of election and chosenness and eschatology in that way, is, I think, a far better foundation to build on than what has been being built on in the past, because we're seeing the fruit of that now. And it's not good fruit, I think, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think it's easy to forget or never to learn that the Eastern churches have been doing their own thing for a really long time. Like the Syrian Orthodox Church, if I remember correctly, dipped out around the time of the Council of Nicaea. They were like, no, this isn't for us. We're going to go. And then, the Great Schism, you have the Eastern churches about 1,000 years ago saying, we like this. You can't make us not do this. We're going to go do our own thing. And when I've heard Orthodox priests or whatever they have talk about like Zionism and stuff, they're like, what do you mean? We're Israel. Like, that's us. It's only us. The Christians, people say, the Christians, there's Palestinian Christians and Syrian Christians. It's like, well, yeah, but it's not it's a little different. It's the most replacement theology of all the replacement theologies. It's very self-conscious about it, and it's proud of it, so, at least as far as I understand it, it's not something that I've done a lot of research on. But.
Well, and an interesting thing too, just to realize how much of this is imposed on the scripture from outside theological systems, is often when people in the Middle East come to the Lord and just read the scriptures without any kind of external input, they will often naturally conclude that Israel is the elect of the Lord, and not be offended by that. I think particularly about the underground church in Iran, which is often, I don't want to say universally, but often very, very friendly to Israel and to her scriptures, because of how they came to the Lord was pretty cut off from a lot of the more ancient, as you said, some of them are very ancient theological systems and ways of interpreting the scriptures. And they do a plain reading with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and come away with very different conclusions from a lot of the church fathers. So, again, don't want to make blanket statements about that.
Right.
There are always exceptions and to the rule and things like that. But I think the underground church in Iran is a good example of a group of people previously very hostile to the Lord, to the people of his covenant. And then when they embrace the Lord, they then also embrace the people of his covenant as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I mean, reading the Bible, if you start at the beginning, it's hard to, it's Israel, 100% Israel all the way through. And then, you get to Paul and you sort of pick up what he's laying down. He's talking to, if you're not Israel, here's who you are. Yeah. So your journey, how you came to this, was it Joel Richardson's book, and you're like, and that just sort of blew your mind, and like, it's like, oh, the gospel of the kingdom, and you adopted like a first century apocalyptic perspective, or was there like more of a process, like did going to the Middle East like change or shape your theology to where like you call it the apocalyptic perspective? We call it at First Design a Messianic Jewish perspective, a first century Jewish perspective. I think there's a ton of overlap in those terms. I think we were all sort of talking about the same things, but what was the turning point for you? Was it Islamic Antichrist?
I think there were a couple different calls that I was wrestling with. I definitely felt drawn to Muslim ministry. And I had a love of Israel that was strong, but it was vague. It wasn't very much anchored anything. I remember making high school friends do Passover Seders, and I wasn't raised in a Messianic. I just loved it. I loved the law of the Lord. There was a lot of things that I had these kind of vague senses, but didn't have language to kind of affirm or deny whether or not those were valid ideas about the scriptures and what the Lord was saying. And so there were definitely seeds over time. I think Islamic Antichrist was a seed, and not necessarily even for the Islamic perspective that it provided, but just even the permission to be more unapologetically eschatological in orientation, and not worrying about that being weird or putting too much emphasis on secondary issues and things like that, which often are evangelical ways of ignoring something. And then you also had the several steps whilst being in the Middle East where I'd be under different teachings. I discovered First Fruits of Zion. I discovered a group of teachers called the Daniel Training Network. You've had a few of those guys on as well, and just started listening to a lot of teaching and reading a lot of books, because so much of what I was being taught was actually fairly radical. It was the implications were very different than what I'd been raised on. So I wanted to be cautious, because I thought, am I getting caught up in something that is actually a flash in the pan or a cult or something just completely out there. But the more I read and the more I went back to the scriptures that suddenly, seemed illuminated to me, the more I loved the Lord for his faithfulness. I felt like there's a lot of fruit in this worldview and this perspective. It seems to align most closely with the scriptures, most closely with reality as I see it. And so I owe so much to those different teachers to be able to kind of guide me through that journey. But it was definitely, it's an ongoing journey. But it was many, many years to kind of get from point A to point B.
Yeah. I mean, for me too, you do wonder as you're going along the path, like you look back and you think, wow, I was so sure that was right. Is this okay? Like, do I have the freedom to explore these ideas? Am I in danger?
Absolutely.
Spiritual danger. But like you said, yeah, correspondence with the scripture and then correspondence with reality. And you just, it just feels, it all clicks. It all comes together. It's like, oh, I know what all the Bible verses mean now, instead of just some of them. Like,
well, and I'm so grateful to First Fruits of Zion, because you have such a anchor in history as well. Because that was one of the things, has anybody taught this before the last 20 years? Because so many of the teachers I was listening to, I could only find that they'd been teaching, just the last couple of decades. And just seeing that, from first century onward, though it's often been a minority voice in the body, there's always been people within the body of believers who've been teaching these things. And just having that encouragement and that confidence. It's not new, that it's not some kind of innovation with the scriptures, but it's a voice that's been crying in the wilderness for centuries, for millennia, and to be able to make that connection has been encouraging as well.
Yeah, good. So you talked about, you briefly mentioned sort of having to sift through all of the information and disinformation. I subscribed, unsubscribed from cable and broadcast television sometime around 2008. But a lot of information finds its way to me, but a lot of whatever the opposite of information is finds its way to me. And it can be hard to sort through everything and find the truth within the lies or within the propaganda. So I thought maybe I'd pick your brain a little bit, because you have written on you are ended up not being one of the people who didn't know anything about what was happening in the Middle East. And I thought I'd pick your brain a little bit about what is going on. For example, what's going on in Syria?
That's always the question, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, because you have these guys coming in and just all they had to do was learn how to drive one tank, and they took over Syria apparently. And you have a bunch of people saying, yes, Syria is finally free of Bashar al-Assad. And you have other people saying, that's literally Al-Qaeda, or that's literally ISIS or something that just took over. It would have been better with the other guy. And it's like, well, no, they're Zionists now. And then someone else is like, no, they're not. They're pretending to be Zionists. And it's like, oh, I mean, my brain hurts. You know, I like to know things, and I feel like I don't know anything. So can you tell me something about what's happening in Syria?
Like if I start, you're going to feel like you know even less by the end. So,
oh no!
But I'll give it my best shot. I did for my university studies. I did international relations with a focus on the Middle East. And it's so interesting. You have these kind of academic approaches to the geopolitics of the Middle East, and it's a very, very complicated region's alphabet soup of acronyms and groups, and very complicated histories and very complicated politics within each country. And so when you don't have that context, both historical and regional, it's so difficult to even begin to be able to discern what's true, what's false. And I have to tell myself that all the time, because I thought if I saw stories about something happening in China, I'd have no clue. I don't know very much Chinese history. I don't know very much about Chinese politics or geography or anything like that. I would be at the mercy of whoever was reporting to be able to give me those relevant facts. And so often, unfortunately, even more and more in this day and age, people are not reporting to inform you. They're reporting to convince you. And so they're very selective. And they also will leave out very, very important context. And human beings, our brains are designed to fill in context. And so if we don't have the context we need, we make up the context. And we're often led, very strongly hinted at what context we should make up for these different scenarios. Syria in particular is a very, very interesting example of all of this, because it's got so many different groups and minorities and affiliations and histories that no one has any idea about, and you can't be an expert in everything. And I think the reporting on Syria has been pretty abysmal. Just to maybe give an example, in 2016, there was a widespread reported story. You might have even seen it, although you've unsubscribed, so you might not have seen it in 2016, about that Assad had built these crematoriums next to his major prison complexes. And you had Nikki Haley being quoted in the New York Times saying, this is reminiscent of some of the worst crimes against humanity from the 20th century, i.e., this looks a little bit like a concentration camp to us. And there had been many red lines crossed in Syria by that point, and I was very focused on Syria, and there had been chemical weapons usage. There had been many reported and documented atrocities done by the Assad regime. The civil war that had started would not have lasted as long as it did without the intense support of both Iran and Russians. And so if you were going to take a hands-off approach, say Western powers were taking a hands-off approach, there were certainly other regional powers who were not taking a hands-off approach on the other side. And so you had this this mix of terrible things happening, but it not making international news for very long. So when I saw this article in 2016, I thought, finally, this is it. Someone's going to do something about Syria. They've been suffering for years and years and years. There's been horrific atrocities that have been committed with numbers that Westerners can't even comprehend. And it was maybe in the international news cycle for 24 hours, and then it was gone. And I thought, so much for never again, so much for this idea of the global community will not permit mass slaughter of human beings in these places. And when the war in Ukraine started, I had a lot of Syrian friends call me, and there was a lot of mixed feelings because the war in Ukraine was getting a lot of attention, and they were happy for it to get attention, but they couldn't understand why that had stayed in international headlines so much longer than these, exponentially more horrific things that were happening in Syria. And they were reasoning that maybe it was because it's the Middle East and Europeans don't care as much about the Middle East. It's not as close to home. But then, of course, when you get to Israeli conflicts, those never leave the international headlines. Things in Gaza never leave. And it was just so bizarre to Syrians that they were just completely forgotten people into the international community. And I think part of it is the complicated nature of reporting on Syria, but a lot of it was, it was just indifference by the international community to the suffering of the Syrian people. You also, as you said before, I had a really beloved Syrian Arabic teacher when I was living in Jordan, and she didn't speak any English, which made her one of the best Arabic teachers I've ever had. But she knew that I was very interested in kind of international politics, and so she tried to always send me articles in Arabic and tried to give me a good vocabulary in that area. And she would send me so much propaganda from Assad about his kindness to Christians. He's visiting these Christians in the hospital. He's doing this, he's doing that. And on the other hand, I'm having people from our Syria team send me pictures of chemical weapons being dropped on nearby towns and things like that. And I was got into a couple tussles online with some Christians about the Assad regime. And they said, Assad protects Christians, we should support Assad. And I was thinking, Christians can't approach international politics like this. Like, we can't say Hitler's protecting us, therefore we will support Hitler. That can't be our modus operandi. But it is difficult because they have a point. Right now, many minorities within Syria are rightly worried. Rightly terrified because the majority group in Syria are the Sunni Arabs. And the worry was, if Sunni Arabs come into power, then they will be able to do whatever they like to the minority groups there. And they don't have a particularly great record in that area. And so you have groups like the Kurds, the Druze, Christians, within Syria, very, very, very nervous about this latest development. But you also have a lot of people, myself included, thinking anything is better than Assad. And so just not saying that the new order is necessarily going to be better. I think it's right to be suspicious. They are definitely Turkish-backed in many ways, at least many of the major factions in the rebel coalition that kind of has recently taken over Syria. But on the other hand, what was going on for the last decades within Syria, I'm sure we'll be uncovering over the next few years. And I think will surprise many people who haven't been paying attention to the atrocities going on in Syria. And so on one hand, I'm relieved with that. The other thing is that when I was part of the Good Neighbor Project in Syria, we were mostly working with the FSA, which is the Free Syrian Army. It was a medical relief team. So if anyone needed medical treatment, even if ISIS rocked up and they wanted medical treatment, we would give them medical treatment. But the main people that the IDF was working with and the main people that we were working with were the Free Syrian Army, which was ostensibly a secular group. That was one of the earlier kind of rebel coalitions against the Assad regime. But unfortunately, when that area fell to Assad, a lot of them went north towards Turkey and joined more extremist groups that are the ones who are now taking over Syria. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I know that's probably not the most popular perspective at the moment. I don't think that Turkey's up to any good. They are unapologetically expansionist. They've been continuously bombing Kurdish areas in Iraq and Syria as well. That also is something that never makes it somehow to international news. But they've taken significant chunks out of northern Syria already and claimed them for Turkey. So that's something to be, I think, keeping an eye on. But I'm interested to see if Jolani, if he will keep his word and allow an election, and they'll be able to build a new and democratic Syria, or if things will fall apart quickly. It could go either way at this point.
Wow. Tell me more about Turkey, because I lived in Turkey for a little while.
Oh, really?
And yeah, that was in some ways the end of childhood for me. Was spending a year in Turkey when I was about 7 years old, and having to check under the Suzuki Sidekick for car bombs before we could go anywhere. It was a little kind of a wake up call, and in certain ways. And I didn't know, I had no context, like you were saying, for why what was going on there, or who wanted what, and why they thought that blowing people up was the way to get it. And then, when Erdogan came into power, there was a bunch of stuff about that and the weird failed coup that happened some time ago. Because I knew that eventually, if whoever's in charge of Turkey gets too religious, that there's this deep state, right? That I think that's actually might be where the term came from. There's this bureaucracy, the secular bureaucracy and military that will go in and fix it. But it apparently tried and failed, and he consolidated his power. But I don't know what their goal, what's his goal with this thing? What's he trying to do in the Middle East? He's expansionist. Is this, are we looking at are the 1,001 Nights coming back? Are we looking at a caliphate based in Constantinople here, or Byzantium, or a resurrection of the Ottoman Empire? Is that what is Putin trying to bring back the Russian Empire, and Erdogan's trying to bring back the Ottoman Empire? And what's happening?
What is happening? I think I don't want to claim to see into Erdogan's psyche or whatnot, and any of those things. But what's very interesting to me is that he will blatantly put maps up in public speeches, not even just in Turkish. Sometimes he's giving a speech, for English audiences or international press, and he will show Turkey with very expanded borders, big chunk of Iraq taken out. And it's not even saying this is what we think Turkey should look like. This is Turkey, and it will not be its current borders. It will be a big chunk of Iraq, big chunk of Syria, all of Cyprus. And it's very interesting to me, again, that this doesn't really make blips in the international press. Somehow there's a lot of concern about Israel being expansionist, but not a lot of concern about Turkey being expansionist. I would guess that there is some level of wanting to recreate the Ottoman Empire. I don't know. That might have been explicitly stated somewhere. He might have said that at some point. I don't know that off the top of my head. But it's very interesting to me, both Turkey as a NATO ally and as well as a regional power. It's very interesting to me, a lot of the decisions that they make. For instance, I worked for a while with the Australian government actually would go into Jordan and recruit people who could speak a little bit of Arabic but were native English speakers to go up into Iraq and to fill out immense amount of paperwork and do long interviews with people who'd been kidnapped by ISIS because they were facilitating immigration to Australia for people who were the victims of ISIS kidnappings. And so that was quite an amazing experience. And you were spending from morning till evening interviewing and hearing people's stories of their time in captivity with ISIS. But one of the interesting things that I would always ask, and it was one of the questions that I was told to ask, was, okay, what were the phone numbers of your kidnappers when the ransom was paid? Because most of them were recovered either by Kurdish forces capturing an area, or they had their ransom paid either by family or the Iraqi government or something. And so we'd ask for all of the phone numbers, kidnappers, all of this. And if you remember at its height, ISIS controlled huge swaths of Syria and Iraq. But not Turkey. But every single number that I was given for, doing interviews like this for weeks and weeks and weeks, without fail, they were all Turkish. What? And I mean, I think a lot of the people coming in, it was well known that most people were coming in to join ISIS through the Turkish-Syrian border. They would just they'd fly into Turkey and then cross the border into Syria. Apparently they were getting SIM cards along the way. But it was really an eye-opening moment for me to realize, I think because of this and many other kind of little clues along the way, that Turkey really facilitated ISIS and the whole destabilization of that particular region. Was it so that they can step in and then kind of take over? I don't know. They somewhat did that. Or if there are other reasons, I don't know. But there's quite a connection between Turkey and ISIS. And there's many people and many think tanks that have kind of plumbed those depths. But it's something worth knowing as we're looking at Syria and wondering what will happen next, particularly with Turkey having so much influence at this point.
Yeah. Somewhere I read, I don't know, it was probably on Twitter or something. Someone was saying that, like, there's the Turkish embassy in Malaysia was giving jihadis from all over the region, like from wherever over there in Southeast Asia, and even like from China, and we're giving them like Turkish passports and sending them all to Turkey, and they would cross into Syria and to do ISIS, whatever ISIS is doing. And it's like, wow, that's wild. I mean, it wasn't just like that Turkey was supporting locals. They were importing people from all over the place is what it sounded like. And I know if that was like true or just, but I put it in the back of my mind. Like, I wonder if that's real. That's kind of that shows a lot of intentionality and a lot of planning and a lot of structure that was built to what end? It's a good question. What are they trying to do? We'll have to watch for you, but you don't hear about any of this on the news.
No, and it's very interesting because a lot of it's not hidden, and that's what's very surprising to me. A lot of it is just very explicitly stated by Erdogan and other people, or there's very clear evidence. But if it's not picked up and widely distributed by these big, by BBC or New York Times or whatnot, it tends to just kind of be a blip, and then people are on to the next thing. So good to kind of bear that context in mind. I hadn't heard that story, but it wouldn't surprise me if a Turkish embassy was up to that sort of thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, what's next for you? I mean, is this, have you found, you've probably, obviously this is something that you're going to be doing for a while, but, personally, what do you see in the future? Do you see yourself ever going back to the mission field, or
Yeah, I definitely don't want to rule that out. If the Lord, I feel like a lot of the way that the Lord has led me in my life, I've not been able to foresee. It's been a bit of a surprise, each twist and turn. But He's very kind. He's very generous in the way that He just makes it very clear when there's a big shift that this is what He wants and this is where He's leading me. And so at this point, the last marching orders I got was to go to Cambridge to serve at Tyndale House and to work on learning and growing in my understanding of the scriptures and the original languages of the scriptures. So that's my main focus for the moment. And the next step could be in many different directions. I definitely don't rule out going back to the field if that's the door that opens. But we'll see.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to reading about it on your blog.
Oh, thanks. That's very
You haven't posted very much on your blog lately.
I haven't. No, I've been busy at work, but I'm hoping that this new year will give me some opportunities to do some more writing.
There you go.
That's one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah. 2025. This is it. This
Resolution.
is the year.
Absolutely.
You're going to blog and I don't know what I'm going to do. Oh man. I haven't thought about it.
You still have a few hours.
It snuck up on me. Yeah. We're recording this on New Year's Eve day. And, I think my resolution may be to vacuum.
That's a good resolution. I might steal that from you.
You don't vacuum over there. You hoover.
That's right. Absolutely. Just hoover up this area. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. But thanks for coming onto the podcast. I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners have learned a lot and have been inspired for the goal of missions among Muslim peoples and have a little better understanding of what's going on over there.
Thank you so much for having me, Jacob. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzek. Shalom.
Let His word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let His love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.